Hey, what's up, everybody? My name is Andrew, and welcome to the inaugural episode of the Bad Eye Podcast, your one stop shop for sane lefty millennial takes about politics, culture, and everything in between. Before we get started, I just want to give a quick shout out and a big thank you to the phenomenal SazJazzParis for allowing me to use his music. If you were as into that banger of an intro as I was, I highly recommend you check him out. You can find him on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube at SazJazzParis. That's SazJazzParis, or in the description box below if you're watching on YouTube. With that out of the way, let's get into it. So, who am I and why am I doing a show? As I said, I'm your host, Andrew, and I am coming at you very pre recorded from my home office studios, an up and coming studio in Toronto, Ontario that actually just is my home office. Millennial jokes. The reason I wanted to start this show is because 2024 was a ride, y'all. We are living in crazy times. And I feel like more and more lately, I found myself watching the news and just like not hearing my own perspective or the perspectives of people around me reflected like at all. And also, real talk, I think my family and friends are getting tired of listening to my dinner table rants. So we're going to see if this can be like an outlet for me to stop annoying everyone around me with tirades about how bad capitalism is for the average person. I'm also probably obnoxiously Torontonian. Like, I just found out where St. Catharines is like 4 years ago, and I am 32 years old. So while we are going to talk about all sorts of global stuff, my perspective is distinctly Canadian and very Torontonian. And I want to talk about issues that affect me. So, in addition to the kind of global stuff that we'll be talking about, I'm also going to try and talk about as much local stuff as I can without putting us all collectively to sleep because, let's face it, Canada is boring as fuck, y'all. And talking about it is also often boring as fuck. Our politics is all the corruption and general neoliberal shittiness of America, but with like none of the showmanship or even the charisma. But this is the place where I live. This is my community, and it definitely has issues. So I'm going to try and push past that and bring you some local takes that are delivered in a way that hopefully does not make us all want to claw our eyes out from boredom. So if you, like me, have been consuming Canadian media for the last 2 decades, just absolutely fiending for literally any opinions that are progressive for a year after like 1989, you come to the right place. I do want to say, like, I know that I won't be the only Canadian leftist podcast out there. There are definitely people in this space doing great work already. I'm not claiming to be the first person to have had this idea, but we are currently living through the shittiest, most protracted, anticlimactic ass apocalypse possible. So I'm trying to do what I can to help, and my only real skill is talking. So we'll see if I can add anything to the conversation that's meaningful, and if not, hopefully I'm at least entertaining. It won't all be Canadian content. So if you're listening from outside of Canada, I promise there'll be stuff in here for you too. But who knows? You may learn a thing or two about the place, and then you can stop telling everyone you're going to move here whenever you lose an election in your country. I do want to stress that we're going to talk about fun stuff too, mostly for my own personal sanity, but also because I'm trying to make content that I want to consume. And it turns out that that content is a 32-year-old man talking about what even is the point of society. In the same place he talks about where the best beef patty in the city is and why it's so dumb how mad people are about the trailer for The Witcher 4. Basically, I'm hoping we can build a community here where people like me can talk about the things that matter to us and to our communities, and hopefully have a little fun while doing it. On that note, I want you guys to be a part of the process too. So if you've got stuff you want to hear me talk about, you can send it in to submissions@badeyepodcast.com and we'll have a look and maybe cover it on the show if we think it's interesting. I've got big plans for more content and for more types of content. So if you get to the end of the episode and you like what you hear, please do consider subscribing. And if you really like it, you can spread it far and wide. Share it on social media, share it with your friends, tell everybody you know, shout it from the rooftops if you want. Do all of the things that I don't do when I like something because I like to sit on the things that I like and never tell anyone about them. Don't be like me. Please share the podcast. Now, I know I just said we'd talk about fun stuff, and I promise that is coming, although probably not in this episode. But I do think that it would be remiss of me not to start the show with some more serious stuff as we start 2025 in what I will generously call a precarious position, globally speaking. 2024 was not a great year for those of us who care about like literally anything good ever happening. The news really newsed super hard last year, like all year. Like things just kept happening. And it feels like most of them were bad. We saw the rise of the far right all across the world. Obviously, the re-election of Donald Trump, which we'll come back to later. The inexplicable continued relevance of Elon Musk, despite his obvious lack of any real skills or charisma. The, at the time of recording, on pause, but honestly likely ongoing genocide in Gaza and Israel's larger campaign of violence across all the surrounding countries, which has not stopped. Russia and Ukraine is somehow still a thing, and just the general mainstreaming of like I would say at best quasi-fascist, but really actually fascist ideology in mainstream Western political discourse. It feels like we're living in like a real life YouTube comment section, and it sucks. Governments are collapsing like all over the place, from South Korea to France. Here at home in Canada, our government is, I guess, on hold until they decide if we're going to be keeping a country or whatever. And there's just a general feeling of uncertainty about the coming year, but I don't hear a lot of optimism about it holding anything good. However, you feel about the events of the last year, the fact that my dad and I had a conversation over Christmas about the very real possibility that there might be another world war and the precautions that we as a family can take to try and avoid getting caught up in the violence is a sign of something. Whether or not you feel like that's likely to happen, the fact that it's even a conversation that anyone is having in a remotely serious way is insane. There's a general sense, I think, that things are very bad, and I feel like the prevailing opinion of most people that I know, at least, is that they are going to get worse. I don't want this to be a podcast about American politics, but I am recording this in the wake of somehow the second Trump inauguration of my lifetime, at which the richest man in the world did the most fucking autistic Sig Heil I have ever seen. So I guess we're talking about it. And before you come for me, I'm not using autistic pejoratively, I am using it descriptively. I myself am a little neurospicy. I'm not autistic, but I'm definitely something. And I want to be very clear that there's nothing wrong with being autistic. But I am saying it is crazy to do a whole ass Roman salute that is so uncoordinated that you immediately mark yourself as someone who the people whose salute you're borrowing would have tried to eugenics out the gene pool ASAP. Like, what are we doing? I don't want to downplay the very real danger of the rise of fascism in the United States. I think that it will have horrifying consequences, both within the US and across the world. People are going to suffer and die because of this. And I hate that I can't even focus on the reality of that and like really sit with the gravity of it because of the indignity of the fact that the people in charge of it are such fucking dweebs, man. Like, they are so embarrassing. And it is embarrassing that the world has allowed them to have this much power. We are being collectively cucked by a cult of less charismatic white Steve Urkels. Like, a crucial part of fascism is the appeal to traditional masculinity. The harkening back to a time when men were men and women were women, and when strong men led the nation. That's why they're so obsessed with trans people and why they bring them up so often, even though they're a tiny part of the population. They need to stamp out anything that deviates from the traditional norm because they believe in a society where the foundation is a hierarchy, where men, and especially in the Western context, white men, are at the top. And it's so fucking embarrassing that these are the guys who think they're at the top of that hierarchy. Because how did we arrive at a place in the world where these are the guys who think they're that guy? Like, have you ever noticed that the whitest supremacists never look like the guys from the propaganda posters? The guys at the forefront of this new wave of American fascism, all of these guys are either built like the snitch kid Randall from the show Recess or an actual fucking canned ham. And they are all so clearly just like Chernobyl disasters of insecurity. Like, it just spews out of their mouths like superheated steam that turns into like a radioactive rain that just falls all over the surrounding areas and makes everyone else stupid for generations. Listen, there's no such thing as an alpha male. That's not like a real thing, not in humans, not even in wolves. It's been conclusively disproven as a theory. But there is nothing less alpha than simping for dudes who do not give a shit about you because you see them as like strong masculine leaders. It is the daddy issues lower back tattoo of political ideology, and it is fucking embarrassing. People complain all day, every day about how the woke left has gone too far. And I normally don't like to give that idea the time of day, but there is one area where I agree with those people. We gotta bring back bullying, man. We have been way too nice to the nerds. And look, I'm a card carrying nerd myself. I was reading the novelizations of the lore from Magic the Gathering in middle school, so this is really friendly fire here. But honestly, I would have taken a swirly for the team to avoid whatever this bullshit is. Like, there is no universe in which Elon Musk and Stephen Miller should have ever been able to gain the self-confidence to sit at the forefront of a fascist insurrection. These men belong around a table with several other dweebs playing an uninspired game of Dungeons and Dragons with no female characters, not as puppet masters behind the first Manchurian candidate to object to the name because it's too Chinesey. But beyond that, and beyond the like avalanche of bullshit that has been Trump's first week or so in office, the ICE raids, the ridiculous executive orders, the jingoistic threats, renaming the Gulf of Mexico for some reason. What's most concerning to me is the reality that the world's superpower has basically descended into kleptocratic oligarchy. And we seem to be rapidly approaching like a technocrat dystopia. He didn't even let regular people into his glorified fascist coronation, but he had every tech billionaire lined up behind him, looking like they were trying to curry favor, like he was a fucking Byzantine emperor, recalling the exarchs from the provinces to kiss the ring. It feels like these guys played Cyberpunk 2077 and completely missed the fucking point. Techno feudalism is supposed to be a cautionary tale, not a manual for how to build and organize a society. And look, the reality is that on a level, it has been this way for a while. Ever since the influence of large scale corporate lobbying became a thing, particularly in America, but throughout the Western world, I don't know enough about the politics of Europe to know whether or not massive, large scale corporate lobbying is a thing the way that it is in the US and certainly in Canada, but my guess is that it is. And ever since corporate lobbying has been a thing, these oligarchs have seen themselves as basically daimyos who are allowed to and should be able to curry favor with whoever currently sits on the throne. But it feels like this particular election cycle in America has really been a mask off moment for these people. And this is particularly scary for the big tech billionaires because they effectively own the public square. The people standing behind the Sith Lord own every communication platform we use. They own the app you found this on. They own the one you're listening to it on. They own the one you're probably scrolling through while you're pretending to pay attention because you're probably on the toilet. In much of the world, they even own the traditional media outlets that many people rely on to be able to know what is and isn't true. They effectively own every avenue that you have to access information and to be able to make informed decisions for yourself about what is true and what isn't true. They basically own the truth. And look, I'm talking to you right now, so they clearly don't have absolute power. But we also know that they've been using the power they do have to promote certain voices, some more blatantly than others. And I think it's fair to be concerned that if they're willing to promote certain viewpoints, now that they're emboldened and they have impunity and they know that they're not going to be checked in any way by any government, they may feel like they have the permission to suppress others. That should concern you. Look, I really do not want to be talking about this, but I am because this is going to affect us too. If you're Canadian like I am, it can be tempting to look at all this and kind of point and laugh. Pointing and laughing at Americans is kind of our whole thing. I feel like our entire national identity is really just like a thinly veiled sense of superiority that we feel over them for being like 2% better than they are on like 20% of issues. The first Trump administration sucked for us too, but we were largely unaffected by most of his crazy the first time around. I don't want to pretend like he didn't have an impact. He absolutely did, but the people that he hurt the most in his first term mostly lived in America or in the places where America hurts people all the time. But I don't think this is like the first time, and I don't think we are as immune as many of us seem to think we are to the kind of dweeby strongman bullshit he's selling. If you don't believe me, go and look in any Indian content creators comment section right now. It is fucking crazy in there. Like, just insanely racist. It don't even matter what the video is about. It could literally have nothing to do with India, nothing to do with race, nothing to do with, immigration at all. It could be a workout video, it could be a restaurant review, literally no matter what the topic is. I guarantee you, if you open one of those comment sections, you will find comments calling them all sorts of racial shit and telling them to go back to India. It is insane out here. And then when you're done, I guess, like purelling your eyes or bleaching your brain or whatever you need to do to clear the filth of that comment section out of your mind, remind yourself that Jordan Peterson taught at the university I went to before he went on to be the world's most offensive, worst dressed Kermit the Frog impersonator. This shit is on the rise here too. Pierre Poilievre is not your daddy's conservative. Not that your daddy's conservative was all that great either, but I feel like a lot of people are not really as awake to that reality as they should be because, like every other Canadian politician, he is a black hole of charisma that devours joy, and it's impossible to watch him speak for more than like 15 seconds without rolling your eyes and falling asleep. But if you can force yourself to stay awake long enough to listen, you'd know that he might not have Trump's charisma, but he also doesn't have his incompetence. And while he might not be an out and out fascist, or at least he hasn't directly indicated yet that he's going to govern as one, ideologically, beyond the fascism, he's making effectively the same points, and he has effectively the same agenda. Massive tax cuts for the wealthy, expand the fossil fuel industry, the demonization and mass deportation of immigrants, and a nebulous anti wokeism, whatever the fuck that means, agenda that he can't really define, but he's definitely sure it means no healthcare for trans people. And in the absence of any serious challenges from the left, any bold and radical policy proposals that will actually make people's lives better in ways that are clear and that they can understand, and maybe most importantly, a charismatic figure with the political acumen and communication skills to actually get people to believe that they're going to do what they say they're going to do, he's going to win. And when he does, just like in America, people are going to suffer. I personally would prefer not to live in a kleptocracy. And look, there's an argument to be made that we already live in a kleptocracy, but let's not double down on it at least. So where does that leave us? Like, yes, I think you should vote against him. If you can, I think you should get organized within your community, both to mobilize to defeat him politically, but also to do mutual aid to try and get through the worst of what is to come, no matter who wins the election this year. But I also don't think, based on what I'm seeing at the time that I'm recording this, that any of our options are particularly good. So, what I really want to talk about is a little bit more abstract because it feels like we're staring down the barrel of a lot, both locally and globally. And that feeling can be paralyzing. So, that's what I actually want to talk about today. That feeling and where I think it comes from and what you can do in the face of it and how I personally have thought through and reframed it for myself so that I don't fall into that trap of just checking out and being apathetic. The first thing I want to say is like, if you're feeling despair right now, I totally get you. If you're too numb to feel anything at all right now, I get you. The last few years, especially if you're a person who's on the left, have definitely felt like sitting downwind from a fan that someone is just flinging like an uninterrupted barrage of shit at. And the last few weeks have felt just as long as like the full year before it. Part of that is the media ecosystem we live in. I don't think I need to point out to anyone how much easier it is to find out about awful things that are happening around the world or even in your own backyard than it was even like 10 years ago. Being constantly afraid that the world was going to shit used to be the purview of like people with paranoia based mental illnesses or like unemployed people who watch too much true crime TV during the day. But now we've all got a little gremlin in our pockets reminding us that somewhere, somehow, everything actually is terrible. The thing is, while people will tell you that that means that it's all overblown and things can't possibly be as bad as you think, that's not the whole truth either. It's true that the human mind just like wasn't meant to process this much suffering all at once. Our worlds used to be much smaller, and our bodies and our minds evolved with that much smaller world in mind. You weren't meant to know about all the bad shit happening all around the world everywhere. At the same time, what you're seeing happen is happening. In the face of that, it is very easy to feel despondent or apathetic, like you have no power and like you can't do anything about it. I know I've definitely felt that way. Sometimes I still feel that way. At times I've legitimately like despaired. I get depressed. I spend a lot of time just very angry. I feel a tremendous amount of guilt at the relatively comfortable life that I live here in Canada, knowing that the price of that life is the suffering of millions of people, many of whom look just like me, and all of whom are just like me. Like whole human beings with hopes and dreams and aspirations and entire inner lives that they may never get to live out because I was born where I was born and I live where I live and we live the way that we do. Like that legitimately keeps me up at night. One issue that particularly brought these feelings up for me in 2024 was the response of my government and governments throughout the Western world to Israel's genocide in Gaza, which, especially like a year in, was so clearly unpopular with so many people that it's kind of baffling that it was met with so little action by any of our leaders. It felt like that really laid bare how unresponsive our governments really are to the will of the people they govern. Like it felt like no poll, no amount of data, no amount of popular protests seemed to have moved the needle on that issue at all. Not for our government, certainly not for the US government or most of the governments of Europe. A ceasefire did eventually happen, but even now it's not permanent, and Israel has escalated its actions in the West Bank and is still enjoying basically the same level of impunity we've been giving them up until this point. In fact, rather than responding to the obvious will of like a huge number of people that they govern, nearly all the young people they govern, we watched Western governments torpedo the international rules based order that they have been championing this entire time since World War II to avoid doing something that people clearly want. Like, yes, there's a minority of people at this point who support what Israel is doing, but the polls are clear and the people have spoken, but our governments still seem to be hedging their bets. Now, look, this isn't an episode of Israel, although there likely will be one coming because I have a degree in Middle Eastern history and I cannot wait for people to tell me that I'm not educated enough about this issue to talk about it when I am specifically educated about this issue. But I'm bringing it up now because more than any other issue that has come up in the last few years, that one made me personally go like, what the fuck are we even doing here? Like, as a society, what is the point of all this? What is the goal? What do we think we're trying to achieve? Because whatever it is, this ain't it. And in the context of the feeling of powerlessness and apathy that I've been talking about, one of the things that I started to think through was that exact question. Like, I'm really asking. I want you to think about it too. Like, what are we doing here? What is the point of society, of having a civilization? Why do we need it? Why do we need any of this? Why do we need governments and economies and nations and financial markets and cars and online retailers and restaurants and movie theaters? To be clear, I'm not saying that we don't need those things, at least not necessarily. This isn't a call to tear down society. I'm not personally an anarchist. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Some of my best friends are anarchists, but I personally am not an anarchist. But I think it's important to ask the question because I think we can get kind of lost in the weeds about the particulars of politics and the specific issues that we're talking about. And we lose sight of, any kind of goal or strategy for what we are trying to achieve with a global system and a global society. Like, I'm asking, in a real sense, what is the purpose of having all that? And more importantly, what should it be? We never ask that question. Like, if it's just to help people survive, it's clearly not doing that. Now, you might say the victims of that genocide and the various other ongoing genocides that are happening right now are not a part of our society. And I would dispute that because I think that we ought to think of ourselves as one global society. But even outside of that, like, no matter where you draw the boundaries, people die preventable deaths from poverty, from violence, and from neglect all the time. Beyond which, on an individual level, you don't need a society to survive. You certainly don't need one on the scale that we have. If this were just about survival, you as an individual could survive all on your own. You need skills you probably don't currently have, but if you were born into a world without society and without civilization, as long as you learn to find food and water and shelter, you could survive. So that can't be the point of it. So then what is? We may not need society to survive in like the literal basic sense, but we do need it to like live. There's more to life than survival. And if you want to live, if you want to thrive, if you want to do anything with your time on this earth besides go from meal to meal, you need people. If you want cuisine and not just food, if you want art, if you want music, if you want culture, if you want any of the things that make life worth living, you need a society. To me, the point of having a society is, or at least it should be, to enable people to live full, rich lives full of meaning and purpose. However, they define that for themselves. If we're going to do all this, it should be so that people can live their best lives. And if that is the point of society, we are failing miserably at it. And I don't just mean Canada. I don't just mean the West. I mean globally. As a global society, we do not do that. Our global society seems to have very little interest in even the majority of people living full, real lives with dignity and purpose. In fact, the way that it's organized requires a whole underclass of people to be purposefully denied that life. Even for people like me, people who we'll call globally privileged. I'm not rich and I'm not poor, but I live a relatively comfortable life in a rich country. Most of us live to work. We might get a little bit closer to the kind of fully actualized life that I'm talking about than like a day laborer who picks our food or like a factory worker making t-shirts in Bangladesh for 18 hours a day. We may get to benefit a little bit more from some of the fruits of capitalism by virtue of our class and our position in the world. But if you are one of those people like I am, if you really ask around and talk to the people in your life and ask them, like, if they didn't need to work to live, would they be spending their days doing what they actually spend most of their lives doing? I think most of us would say no. We live in a global society that prioritizes the interests of capital over and above the interests of people. The things that happen, good or bad, happen because they are profitable to someone somewhere. And if they aren't profitable, they don't happen. This is as true of our food system as it is of our politics. It's how we make art, it's how we make culture, it's how we make everything. That's what capitalism is. And proponents of capitalism, people who think of this system as a good system, will say things like, it has lifted so many people out of poverty. Or my favorite one, it's a horrible system, but I can't think of a better one. And all sorts of other stuff to justify that, because it is the way of things. And I'm gonna be honest with you, I don't have a fully fleshed out alternative. You're not gonna get a fully fleshed out economic system out of me in this podcast episode. I've read some political theory, but I'm not a political theorist. My personal politics are what I would consider leftist, and I am sympathetic to economic ideas that lean in that direction. And if you're listening to this and not like losing your mind, you probably are too. But I would not personally look for a full solution that addresses all of the fundamental flaws of capitalism in an hour-long podcast episode by some random guy on the internet. And I don't think you should either. Solving that problem is going to take many more people than just me and you. But I don't think you need a fully fleshed out solution to the problem to be able to point out that there are real fundamental issues with capitalism, and that capitalism as an ideology, as an economic system, as a way of organizing society seems to be fundamentally missing the point of society that we just talked about. Because its ultimate aim is the creation of value in the form of profit, but as a system, it has no interest in actually enabling people to live their best lives. It can and does do that sometimes for some people, but it also requires other people not to be able to do that. We cannot live our lives based on consumption. We can't structure our culture around what we consume without an endless stream of affordable goods and services. And we can't have an endless stream of affordable goods and services without someone somewhere making those goods and performing those services for less than what we pay for them. And those people don't have an endless stream of even cheaper goods and even cheaper services to buy. Eventually, there has to be a bottom, and there needs to be people at it. Until robots replace all manufacturing and service work, and even then, because someone's going to want to make money off those robots, the system we have will never even allow most people to live the kind of life that we in wealthy countries enjoy. And it definitely won't allow people to live the kind of fully realized life that I'm actually talking about, that almost no one gets to enjoy. And if, like I'm suggesting, the whole point of society is to be able to allow people to do that, to me, capitalism ain't it. And if you feel like that's not what the point of having a society is or should be, I'd ask you to think it through for yourself. Like, what is it then? And why shouldn't it be? I realize that that sounds kind of pie in the sky to people, and you're free to disagree with me if you want. There's a cynical reaction to that idea that even I've had, that that's impossible. We live in a finite world with finite resources, and it's just not possible for everyone everywhere to be able to live the lives that they actually want to live and still have everyone's basic material needs met. And look, I don't even necessarily disagree with that. But again, I would ask you, shouldn't we at least try? Shouldn't that at least be the goal? If we fail, sure, we live in an imperfect world. I'm not in denial about that. That's not something I'm just pretending isn't true. But I think a lot of the powerlessness and the apathy that we feel comes from the fact that we're not even starting from the premise that that's something that we should all want. We're having arguments about whether or not that's even the goal. And in the face of that, it can be easy to just kind of check out. So many people have this idea that the world is this cruel, hostile, inherently unfeeling and uncaring place. And when they talk about it, they'll use examples from nature. They'll cite like natural disasters or the food chain or the inherent competition to survive that is like animals in the wild. And they'll point to all of that and they'll say that's the natural order of things. So why should society be any different than that? And I understand that impulse. Like, we are animals and we are still on a level subject to a world that actually just doesn't care about us. It's true that earthquakes and hurricanes do not care whether you live or die. That's not really up for debate. It's just factual. But society is not nature. It's not natural. It's a human thing. It's a thing we created. And treating it like it is nature, like it's something that we have no control over, is really the source of that apathy. It's a way to create and excuse it in favor of the status quo. And look, I totally get the impulse towards apathy. I'm a truly prodigiously lazy person. I love nothing more than to just do nothing. It is literally my favorite way to spend an afternoon. And when you're inundated with so much awful shit all the time that you are genuinely unable to do anything about, it's not just easier, it might even be healthier for you not to care that deeply. Like I said, we are not designed to consume that much suffering. The scale of it, I think, kind of breaks our brains. Like 10 people dead is a tragedy. If you know 10 people and they die, you'll be affected by that. 100 people dead is a tragedy. Like you can conceive of 100, even if you don't know 100 people in a personal way really well. You've met 100 people in your life. You can conceive of that in a way that makes sense to you, and you can process it emotionally. Even 1,000 people dead, like I can wrap my head around that. But 10,000 people is a headline. 1,000,000 people dead is something out of a textbook. I don't have an emotional way of processing that. I don't have the emotional capacity to process it. And so when harm is done on that scale, whether it's a tsunami or a war, I think a lot of people just kind of go, well, that's the way the world is. Stuff like that just happens. There's nothing I can do about it. And that's true for the tsunami. You're not going to win a fight with the ocean. You're also not going to change the ocean. There's nothing you can do as an individual or collectively, even as a society. There's nothing we can do about the ocean occasionally telling civilization they can go fuck itself and reminding us who's boss. The ocean was here long before us, and it'll be here long after us. But that's not how society works. Society is a human system. And like all human systems, that means it is fundamentally within our control to decide what it does. We talk about systems like they're autonomous machines. We talk about people like they're at the mercy of systems. But a thing that I think we often lose sight of is the fact that every human system is fundamentally made up of humans. It's not a machine. Skynet is not sending the Terminator back in time to show up at grocery stores to fix the price of bread at gunpoint. All human systems, whether it's a government or a financial market or a book club or a military or a fucking PTA, are just a collection of people who have all agreed to participate in making some abstract thing that exists in someone's head into a reality. In the case of a book club, someone has the idea to meet and talk about books, and then everyone in the book club agrees that it's their job to read the books and attend the meetings and talk about the books. Maybe there's wine, maybe there's snacks, but that's a basic principle behind a book club. Everyone goes out, they read the books, they come back. One person probably doesn't read the book, and they just kind of bullshit through the meeting. But the theory is that everyone goes out and they read the book. They make that idea into reality. In the case of a government, the government exists to govern and represent the interests of the people, in theory. The leaders of the government have ideas about how to do that. And the various agencies and bodies of the government take it upon themselves to take actions in the world to make those ideas into reality. The people employed by those agencies go to work and they do the jobs they've agreed to do to realize the visions of the idea people, the people who govern. The more complex the system, the more complex the ideas being realized, but the basic structure is the same. Someone has an idea, and a bunch of other people all agree that it's their job to take steps to make that idea a reality. Now that seems pretty abstract because it is, it's an abstraction. That's how abstractions work. But I want you to think about the implications of it, because to me, this is really the cure for that feeling of apathy. What that means is that everything that happens, good or bad, because of a human system, is really an uninterrupted chain of agreement from the person who had that idea to the person on the ground making the idea real. Every ounce of liberation or emancipation that anyone has ever achieved happened because someone had the idea that it should happen, and a chain of people agreed to do what was necessary to make it happen. And every boot that has ever been on someone's neck could only be there because of that same uninterrupted chain of compliance from the person that decided there should be a boot to the person wearing the boot. Now, if you're still with me, first of all, thank you for going on that little thought journey with me. But to bring things back to a little bit more of a concrete place, the idea that I'm really trying to get across is the idea of the consent of the governed. The idea that larger forces in society, like the government or like, billionaires or whoever it may be, are unable to realize their ideas and make them into reality without the consent of the people who are going to be affected by those decisions. And I want to remind you, in the face of that feeling of kind of paralysis and apathy, and how easy it is to just kind of disconnect when you see all this awful stuff happening, that you do have power and you do have a say, even if it feels like you don't. And I get how tempting it is to just give in to that feeling of paralysis and indulge in that apathy, to just kind of say, fuck it, and check out and focus on your own life and the things that you can control, to throw yourself into your career, into your relationships, into fitness, into literally anything that takes your attention off the world around you and the things that are going on in your community. But when you do that, you relinquish that power, you give up your say, and you make that idea, the idea of your own powerlessness, into a reality. You pre-consent to whatever awful things are going to happen. And beyond that, you give permission to the powerful to not even consult you on their future plans. And in a world the way that it is right now, if you care that the world is the way that it is right now, you simply can't afford to be giving away that power. If you're in America, I probably didn't need to say any of that to you. You've probably been thinking it yourself. You've been definitely hearing it everywhere. And it's probably pretty clear to you that the next few years are going to be hard without me telling you. When the threats you're facing feel unprecedented, this sort of stuff becomes obvious to a lot of people, I think. But here in Canada, I think we've been a little blind, maybe willfully so, to how precarious of a position we're in. And look, I don't know if Pierre Poilievre represents the kind of fascist threat to Canada that America is currently facing with their government. I think that remains to be seen. I personally find his rhetoric troubling. I certainly don't want him to leave the country where I live. But I also think that fascism is a bit of a boy who cried wolf situation, especially in North America. And I think a huge part of the way that America ended up the way that it is they've been crying wolf at, we'll call them coyotes, for a while now. Like they're wolfy, they're definitely wolf-like. They look like wolves, but they weren't exactly wolves. And it just kind of exhausted people to the point where there's a whole pack of real ass wolves now, and a lot of people just do not want to hear it. They're not interested in listening. But I do want to say, like, I don't think it matters whether he's a fascist or not. I really don't. At least not in this context. It definitely matters in terms of how bad it would be if he were to become the prime minister of the country where I live. But in the context of what I'm talking about, in the context of staying engaged and not giving your consent prematurely to anyone's agenda, I think that that's a valid and applicable point regardless of whether he's a fascist or not, regardless of whether he even wins or not, because this is as true of, a conservative candidate who I disagree with as it would be true of any candidate, even one that I do agree with. So I want to say, like, if you're a person with some power and influence, and even if you're not, I mean, this applies to everybody, but particularly if you're a person who's, influential in the private sector, if you're a public servant, if you're in law enforcement or the legal field, if you're in the military or a doctor or a teacher, really whoever you are, like, I think it's important for you to remember you always have the choice not to comply. You are not obligated to agree to make anyone else's ideas a reality if you don't agree that they should be. And I'm not saying you won't face consequences for that. You might, but complying because you fear the consequences of non-compliance is still making a choice to comply. And it's an active choice whether it feels like one or not. You may tell yourself that if you don't do it, someone else will be willing to. And you might be right, but you also might be wrong. And if you comply without ever asking that question, none of us will ever know. Now, look, I've been talking about this in the context of politics up until now, and I think it does obviously apply there. If somehow, wherever you live, you end up in like a South Korea situation where your crazy incel president is trying to get you to shoot your neighbors to subvert democracy in your country, you absolutely have the choice not to do that. If the world's dopiest strongman looks at you through his weird eyes that are so sunken in that the spray tan looks like it's not reaching them properly, and so they somehow always end up looking like two puckered little anuses, gives you your marching orders to burst into a school and round up little kids because their parents are shitty at paperwork, you also absolutely have the choice not to do that. But not every choice is so extreme. And I also want to talk about all the little mundane ways that we give our consent to make other people's awful ideas into reality every day. We think of our consumption, our career choices, of the things that we do in our daily lives as benign, but they very often are not as benign as we think they are. I am definitely guilty of this. I've bought hundreds of things on Amazon because it's convenient, despite the fact that their labor practices are horrible and they undercut businesses and destroy small businesses and all sorts of other terrible things that that corporation does. I doom scroll on Instagram because all my friends are on there and I love a good meme, despite the fact that they are scraping all of our chats to feed into their AI and collecting a huge amount of personal information that they have no need for to sell to other companies. I still sometimes take Ubers and use Uber Eats and participate generally in the gig economy, despite knowing that Uber in particular is notorious for exploitation and that the entire gig economy is an inherently exploitative model of employing labor. And I have justifications for, or at least I have reasons why I do all of those things. Some of them I'm more able to stop doing than others. Like I personally haven't bought anything on Amazon in nearly a year, and I plan to continue to avoid it as much as I can because I have access to easy alternatives. But I'm also not going to stop taking Ubers because they've effectively killed the taxi industry in my city, and sometimes I need to get places that I can't drive to. You probably have behaviors in your life, things that you do for fun, for work, that you think of as benign that really aren't. And what I want to encourage you to do, at the very least, is start thinking about them as if they aren't benign and start thinking about the impacts that they might have on you, on your community, on the planet, and ask yourself, like, what kind of society do I want to live in? And how are the things that I do contributing to the society that I do live in being like one that I'd like to live in or like one that I wouldn't? I think just asking that question helped me break through a lot of the apathy and despair I felt over the last year, because it woke me up to the ways that I actually could make a small difference. Little things that were within my control that I could exercise my agency over. It's part of why I started this podcast, to see if I could reach other people and get them to think about the ways that they could make change in their own lives. And maybe it'll help you too. Maybe you can start your own podcast, and then we all just end up in an endless feedback loop of guest appearances for shows nobody's actually watching. And look, you might not be able to stop doing some of these things. You definitely won't be able to stop doing them all. We live in a capitalist society, and as much of a platitude as it is, there is no ethical consumption under capitalism. There just isn't. But I still think it's worth thinking about. And more than that, I think it's worth talking about with the people in your life because you'll find, I think, if you do start thinking about it that way, that there are changes that you can make. There are ways that you can hold yourself accountable. There are ways that you can hold your friends accountable and ways that they could do the same for you. Maybe you all decide together to divest from that awful social media app you all use to talk to each other and use one that's more secure and privacy minded instead. Maybe you encourage each other to shop locally and not buy so much stuff on Amazon. Maybe they have the answer to that dumb question you were going to ask ChatGPT and you can save a gallon of water or whatever ungodly amount that thing uses per query. Maybe you all finally agree to stop treating the one guy you went to college with who went to work at that defense contractor like he's not a fucking war criminal. I think we all need to be a little bit more clear eyed about our impacts in the world, and also more clear eyed about each other's. Part of community, part of friendship is accountability. There's power even in that, in just recognizing and naming what you choose to give your consent to and identifying where you can maybe withdraw it by changing your behavior so you're not making other people's horrible ideas into reality. You can never fully opt out of the system, whatever that is, but you have more control over your role in it than you think you do. I'm going to leave you this week with a poem. At the end of every episode, I'm going to try and give you like a cool piece of media that I like. It won't always be a poem, and it won't always be topical, but this week it is a poem, and I feel like this particular poem does really capture some of what I was trying to get across in the episode. It's a poem by one of my favorite poets, a Turkish leftist poet from the early 20th century named Nazım Hikmet. And the poem is called Yaşamaya Dair in Turkish, which means on living. I'm going to read it translated into English for you guys, obviously, and this particular translation was done by Mutlu Konuk and Randy Blasing for the anthology Poems of Nazım Hikmet. On living. Living is no laughing matter. You must live with great seriousness. Like a squirrel, for example. I mean, without looking for something above and beyond living. I mean, living must be your whole occupation. Living is no laughing matter. You must take it seriously. So much so, and to such a degree that, for example, your hands tied behind your back to a wall, or else in a laboratory in your white coat and safety glasses. You can die for people. Even for people whose faces you've never seen. Even though you know living is the most real, the most beautiful thing. I mean, you must take living so seriously that even at 70, for example, you'll plant olive trees. And not for your children either, but because although you fear death, you don't believe it. Because living, weighs heavier. Let's say we're seriously ill, need surgery, which is to say we might not get up from the white table. Even though it's impossible not to feel sad about going a little too soon, we'll still laugh at the jokes being told. We'll look out the window to see if it's raining, or still wait anxiously for the latest newscast. Let's say we're at the front, for something worth fighting for, say. There, in the first offensive, on that very day, we might fall on our face, dead. We'll know this with a curious anger, but we'll still worry ourselves to death about the outcome of the war, which could last years. Let's say we're in prison, and close to 50, and we have 18 more years, say, before the iron doors will open. We'll still live with the outside, with its people and animals, struggle and wind. With the outside beyond the walls. However and wherever we are, we must live as if we will never die. This earth will grow cold. A star among stars and one of the smallest. A gilded mote on blue velvet. This, our great earth. This earth will grow cold one day. Not like a block of ice or a dead cloud even, but like an empty walnut, it will roll along in pitch black space. You must grieve for this right now. You have to feel this sorrow now. For the world must be loved this much if you're going to say, I lived. That's it for me this week. If you made it this far, I want to say sincerely, thank you for listening. I hope that you enjoyed the show, and I really appreciate you sharing almost an hour of your life with me, even if you really were just using this to pass the time while you were on the toilet, because you could have been doing literally anything else with that time. If you did like what you heard, please do like and subscribe, or give us 5 stars or a thumbs up, or whatever arbitrary dumb thing means I like this on the platform that you're listening to it on. I will be back with you next week with a different topic and maybe a little bit of a different format. I've never done anything like this before, so I'm kind of figuring it out as I go, and I really do appreciate you bearing with me so that I can try and make this show as good as it can be. If you have any topics you'd like to submit, please do email them in to submissions@badeyepodcast.com. With all that said, I'm Andrew, and you've been listening to the Bad Eye Podcast. Be easy, y'all.